All right, let's get right into it. We are talking about a massive political firestorm, one that basically blew up right on the floor of India's parliament. And what's at stake? Well, it's a huge landmark law that was supposed to empower women, but instead it's kicked off a huge battle over the very balance of power in the entire country. So back in 2023, this historic bill gets passed. The goal? Give women a lot more seats in parliament. And it was celebrated, a huge deal all across the country. But fast forward to right now, and that very same promise has become the trigger for what looks like an all-out political war. So what on earth happened? Let's break it down. Okay, so picture the scene. We're in the Lok Sabha, India's lower house of parliament. The government is trying to introduce some new legislation, but the opposition is just in an uproar. It all leads to one of the most intense, fiery debates we've seen in a long, long time. I mean, you could just feel the tension on the parliament floor. Kaise Gopal, he's a senior opposition leader, and he really just captured the heart of the resistance with these words. He's saying this isn't just a simple disagreement over policy. No, the opposition is claiming the government is attacking the very foundation of the country's constitution. So this all came to a head in April of 2026. The government introduces this package of 3 interconnected bills. Now, they argued these were just necessary procedural steps. But for the opposition, they saw a Trojan horse, a move they pretty much immediately called a constitutional hijack. Now, to really get why these 3 bills are so explosive, we gotta rewind just a little bit. This entire conflict, it actually starts with a promise, a really big promise, but a very conditional one. Okay, so in 2023, Parliament passes the Women's Reservation Bill. It guarantees 1/3 of all seats for women. I mean, a massive step for gender equality. But, and this is the crucial part, here's the fine print. 2 huge conditions were attached. First, it would only be implemented after the next national census was finished. And second, after that census, this giant exercise called delimitation would have to redraw every single electoral map in the country. So the bills that showed up in 2026, they're supposed to finally kickstart that whole long process. So let's take a closer look at the actual legislation the government brought to the table. They didn't just bring one bill, they brought a package of 3. And the opposition, they very quickly gave these a nickname, the sandwich bills. So why that name? Well, because they are so deeply interconnected, you can't really pull them apart. They basically have to be debated and passed together. And that kind of procedural move immediately made the opposition really suspicious. Now, from the government's point of view, this is all pretty straightforward. They're arguing that they are simply following the constitutional path that was laid out in that 2023 law. To them, these bills aren't controversial at all. They are just the necessary steps, both administrative and constitutional, to finally deliver on that promise of women's reservation. But, as you can imagine, the opposition saw it very, very differently. They fired back with 3 major accusations against the government, and each one was more serious than the last. So the first and most immediate accusation was that this whole thing is just a deliberate delay. The opposition basically argued that tying women's reservation to a census and then a delimitation exercise, well, that's a super complicated, time-consuming move that's designed to make sure the law doesn't actually happen before the next big election in 2029. Now, that word, delimitation, it sounds technical, but you have to understand it is at the absolute heart of this entire fight. All it means is redrawing the political map based on new population numbers from a census. And when you redraw the map, you fundamentally change who holds the power. And that brings us to the opposition's second, and maybe its biggest, fear, that this is an attack on federalism. See, for decades, the number of parliament seats for each state has been frozen, partly to encourage population control. The opposition is terrified that if you redraw the seats based on today's population, states in the north, which have had much higher population growth, will gain a ton of seats and power at the expense of the states in the south. And the numbers, which were actually cited in Parliament, show exactly why they're so worried. The Hindi-speaking heartland in the north could see its share of seats jump from around 38% to over 43%. Meanwhile, the southern states' share would drop from 24% to just 20%. This potential shift in the balance of power is a complete red line for a lot of opposition parties. The third objection is all about inclusion. Opposition parties argue that the reservation bill is flawed because it doesn't have separate, specific quotas for women from marginalized groups, especially other backward classes, or OBCs, which is a term for many different disadvantaged castes, and also for religious minorities. The government's response to this was sharp. The Constitution, they said, simply does not allow for reservations based on religion. So with these three huge objections on the table, you could imagine the debate got more and more heated. It led to some direct confrontations, and then a really dramatic, high-stakes vote. One of the sharpest attacks from the opposition was this claim that the real reason for all these complicated steps was to avoid doing a caste census. They argued that the government was afraid that counting castes would just lead to new demands for social justice policies, which it wanted to avoid at all costs. But then came this absolutely stunning rebuttal from Home Minister Amit Shah. He actually stood up on the floor of Parliament and declared with no ambiguity that the government was not avoiding a caste census. In fact, he announced it had already decided to conduct one right alongside the main national census. It was a huge move, really designed to just completely shut down a key opposition attack. So after hours of this fiery back and forth, the Speaker of the House had to make a call. The opposition was absolutely determined to block these bills from even being introduced. So a formal vote, which is known as a division, was called to settle it. And remember, this wasn't a vote on the bills themselves, it was just about whether they could even be discussed. The results came in. The government got 251 votes in favor of introducing the legislation. While the opposition alliance stood strong with 188 votes against, the government had won the first battle. The bills were now officially tabled in Parliament, and the real debate could begin. So, the government won that procedural vote. But let's be clear, this is far from over. What this one single 10-stand Parliament really shows us is that the stakes for India's future are incredibly high. You know, this isn't just some political squabble. The outcome here is going to decide when and how millions of women finally get political representation. It could fundamentally redraw India's electoral map, shifting power between different regions for generations to come. And it forces a national conversation about what true representation actually looks like. And really, that leaves us with this final, crucial question. This whole fight is about redrawing the map of power. The challenge for any democracy that's going through a change this big is to make sure that the process leads to a system that isn't just different, but is fundamentally more just and equitable for every single one of its citizens.